There is something about Ohio in the 1980s that people who lived through it can't forget. The quiet hum of factories at the edge of town, the glow of a television filling the living room after dinner. Friday night football lights cutting through the dark sky, pulling entire communities together. Life didn't feel extraordinary at the time. It felt steady, familiar, predictable in a way that only later generations would come to miss. Ohio in the 1980s wasn't about flash or reinvention. It was about routines that repeated week after week. Parents leaving early for work, kids riding bikes until the street lights came on, malls, driveways, school gyms, and kitchen tables quietly shaping everyday life. And if someone lived through it, they know exactly what made that decade so distinctive. It wasn't the headlines. It was how ordinary life felt while everything underneath was beginning to change. The 1980s in Ohio had a look that felt instantly familiar, even if no one stopped to name it at the time. Suburban shopping malls became the center of weekends, where teenagers wandered without purpose and parents ran errands under fluorescent lights. Denim jackets, varsity sweaters, and worn sneakers filled school hallways. Hairstyles were bigger, louder, and unapologetically shaped by the decade. Cassette tapes clicked into place. Walkmans turned bus rides and bike trips into private soundtracks. Arcades glowed with pixelated light, quarters stacked on machines as kids waited their turn. These weren't rare moments. They were daily scenes, repeating quietly across towns and cities. This became the visual language of Ohio in the 1980s. Ordinary, recognizable, and shared by nearly everyone. The 1980s was a time when Ohio was quietly being reshaped. For decades, the state had been built on manufacturing, steel, and auto plants that promised steady work and long-term security. But as the decade began, that foundation started to crack. Factories slowed down. Some closed entirely. Layoffs became common words in households that had never expected to hear them. This meant uncertainty for working families who had done everything right. Jobs once passed from one generation to the next were no longer guaranteed. Union power weakened. Entire towns felt the impact as paychecks disappeared and downtown areas grew quieter. The term Rust Belt entered the national conversation, and Ohio found itself at the center of it. Politically and economically, the era emphasized change and adjustment. National policies shifted priorities, and the promise of lifelong industrial work faded. By the late 1980s, parts of the economy began to recover, but the sense of security never fully returned. This shaped the identity of Ohio in the 1980s. Daily life in Ohio in the 1980s revolved around the home, especially in the growing suburbs that surrounded cities and small towns alike. Most families lived in modest ranch or split-level houses, built for practicality rather than style. These were neighborhoods where driveways mattered, lawns were carefully kept, and everyone recognized each other's cars. Inside, homes had a look that instantly placed them in the decade. Thick carpeting softened every step. Large sofas faced a boxy television that dominated the living room. Family photos lined the walls. Kitchens were busy spaces, used every day, with dinner served at roughly the same time each evening. After the meal, everyone drifted toward the TV, where nightly routines continued uninterrupted. By the mid-1980s, the VCR became a quiet revolution. Movie nights at home replaced trips out. Recording shows meant families could finally bend television schedules to their lives. It felt modern, convenient, and slightly futuristic. This look became instantly recognizable as 1980s style. If you remember the living room where everyone gathered after dinner, or the first time a VCR changed your evenings, feel free to share that memory in the comments below. In 1980s Ohio, daily life depended on the car. Suburbs stretched far from workplaces, schools, and shopping centers, and driving was simply part of the routine. American-made vehicles dominated the roads. Sedans and station wagons filled driveways, chosen for reliability and space rather than style. Cars were practical tools built for commutes, carpools, and weekend errands. Highways connected suburbs to downtown areas, making it possible to live miles away from work without thinking twice. Gas prices were steadier than in the previous decade, and few people worried about fuel efficiency. For teenagers, getting a driver's license meant independence. For adults, the car represented stability and normalcy. Driving was not just transportation, it was identity. By the 1980s, culture in Ohio moved at the same rhythm as the rest of Middle America, shaped largely by television, radio, and what played in the background of everyday life. MTV changed how music was experienced, even for families far from major cultural centers. Music was no longer just something heard. It was something watched. Teenagers absorbed styles, attitudes, and trends straight from the screen. The Walkman made music personal for the first time. Songs followed people onto buses, sidewalks, and bike rides, creating private worlds inside shared spaces. At home, television remained a ritual. Sitcoms brought families together in the evening. The nightly news still felt important, a trusted voice that framed the wider world before bedtime. Fashion followed what appeared on screen. Denim, sneakers, graphic t-shirts, and carefully styled hair became part of daily identity. None of it felt performative. It felt normal, absorbed gradually through repetition. Culture didn't arrive in Ohio with spectacle. It settled in quietly and stayed. Being in Ohio meant experiencing pop culture the way most Americans did. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this look back at everyday life in another decade, consider liking the video and subscribing. There are many more places and memories still waiting to be explored. In Ohio, few things carried more meaning in the 1980s than football. It wasn't just entertainment, it was tradition, identity, and community pride, woven together. College football defined Saturdays, with Ohio State games bringing entire households to a stop. The Buckeyes weren't just a team, they were a shared language across the state. At the local level, Friday night football mattered just as much. High school stadium lights turned small towns into gathering places. Families filled the bleachers. Band music echoed through cool autumn air. Win or lose, everyone showed up. It was where people connected without needing a reason. Beyond sports, factories, and workplaces functioned as social anchors. Jobs created friendships, routines, and a sense of belonging. This was Midwestern life shaped by loyalty, consistency, and shared effort. This is what made Ohio different. Food in 1980s Ohio was less about trends and more about routine. Most meals were eaten at home, often around the same kitchen table, night after night. Dishes were familiar and filling. Meatloaf, pot roast, casseroles, and simple vegetables showed up regularly, built around practicality and comfort rather than presentation. Fast food, however, was becoming part of everyday life. Chains expanded rapidly, offering convenience to busy families. Ohio had a special connection to that shift. Wendy's, founded in Columbus, felt local even as it grew national. Pizza nights became weekend rituals, and diners remained reliable gathering spots. These flavors defined everyday life in the 1980s. What meal or restaurant instantly takes you back to growing up in the 1980s? Share it in the comments. Chances are someone else remembers it the same way. Life in Ohio in the 1980s carried an undercurrent of uncertainty that was easy to feel but rarely spoken about. As factories closed or reduced shifts, steady paychecks disappeared, and many families were forced to adjust quietly. Downtown areas in industrial cities began to empty out, storefronts closing one by one as jobs moved elsewhere. Young people increasingly looked beyond Ohio for opportunity, leaving behind aging neighborhoods and parents who had expected their children to stay close. For those who remained, there was a growing sense that the future would not look like the past. Security felt temporary. Plans became cautious. Conversations changed. But most people accepted this as part of the era. If your family was touched by layoffs, plant closures, or tough choices during this time, you're not alone. Feel free to share your story or reflect quietly in the comments below. What defined Ohio in the 1980s was resilience. Not the loud, celebrated kind, but the quiet endurance found in ordinary routines. People kept going to work even when jobs felt uncertain. Families held on to traditions, habits, and community ties that gave structure to daily life. There was no dramatic reinvention. There was persistence. For those who lived through it, the decade was a mix of familiarity and unease. Houses were still affordable, neighborhoods still felt connected, football seasons still mattered. Yet beneath it all was the understanding that the old guarantees were slipping away. Ohioans adapted without ceremony, adjusting expectations while holding on to what felt stable. Life carried on with a certain steadiness. The future was unclear, but the present was manageable, and that endurance became the defining trait of the time. For those with memories of this remarkable era, there is always more history to explore. If this journey through Ohio in the 1980s brought back memories, consider subscribing and sharing this video with someone who lived through that decade too. There are many more stories still waiting to be told.